He slid the papers across the table like she was a business transaction he was closing out. No raised voice, no apology, no flicker of anything behind those gray eyes. Just the quiet, devastating efficiency of a man who had already moved on before the meeting even started. CEO Tae-jun looked at his wife of 3 years the way he looked at a lease he was letting expire, with mild inconvenience and nothing else. Nia Whitaker picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. That surprised even her. If you've ever been told, without a single word, that you simply don't matter, then you already know exactly what was happening in that room. And if you haven't, pray you never find out. Before we go any further, if this kind of story hits different for you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're already feeling something, leave a like. It costs nothing, and it means everything to a storyteller. Now, let's go back to that room. Because what Tae-jun didn't know when he watched those elevator doors close was that he had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. The storm had been building over Chicago for 3 days before it finally broke. By the time the first real crack of thunder rolled across Lake Michigan, the windows of the 53rd floor penthouse were already running with rain, thick, silver sheets that made the city below look like something dissolving. Nia had always loved storms. She used to press her palm flat against the cold glass and feel the vibration of the thunder move through her skin. Tae-jun never understood that. He thought she was being sentimental. He thought most things she did were sentimental. She didn't touch the glass tonight. She sat with both hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her face giving nothing away, while 2 men in expensive gray suits arranged documents on the conference table that had replaced the dining table in what used to be their home. Tae-jun had converted the dining room 6 months ago, said they needed the space for meetings. Nia had stopped eating dinner at that table long before it disappeared. The men were attorneys. She didn't know their names, and she didn't ask. They had the practiced blankness of people paid very well to pretend they weren't witnessing something ugly. Tae-jun stood at the far end of the room with one hand resting loosely in his trouser pocket, the other holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. He was wearing a charcoal suit with no tie. He almost never wore a tie in private, and his dark hair was pushed back the way it always was when he'd been running his hands through it during a long day. He looked tired. He also looked completely composed. Those two things coexisted in him in a way that had once seemed like depth to Nia and now seemed like something else entirely. The agreement is straightforward, one of the attorneys said. He had the careful, uninflected voice of someone reading a weather report. Ms. Whitaker retains her personal property, her vehicle, and the contents of her personal accounts established prior to the marriage. All other assets, accounts, holdings, and security arrangements remain with Mr. CO and are not subject to negotiation or division. Nia looked at the stack of papers. It was thick. Someone had spent a considerable amount of time making sure she left with as little as possible. Security arrangements, she repeated. The residential security detail, the vehicles assigned to the household, the personal protection protocols currently in place, those will be discontinued within 48 hours of signing. She looked at Tae-jun then, not to plead, just to understand. He met her eyes without flinching. My world has become more dangerous than it was 3 years ago. Keeping you inside it puts you at risk. That's why you're doing this. Yes. She almost said something. She could feel the words sitting at the back of her throat, hot, ready, 3 years of accumulated understanding pressing forward. She swallowed them. Because she knew the real reason. She had known it for weeks. It had been a Tuesday. The kind of unremarkable afternoon that later becomes the dividing line between before and after. Nia had been passing the study, door half open, not intending to listen. Tae-jun was on the phone with Kwon Min Seok, his strategist, the man who knew every moving piece of the CO organization better than anyone, and they were discussing a territorial negotiation with a rival group out of Detroit. Dry, technical, grim. The kind of conversation she'd learned to slide past without processing. Then Tae-jun said her name. Not tenderly, not with irritation, with a kind of bored finality, the way you'd reference a line item in a budget that needed trimming. He said she brought nothing useful to the organization, that the marriage had made him look soft in certain circles, that it had served its early purpose, establishing a degree of legitimacy, a civilian face for certain public dealings. But that purpose had run its course. Nia had stood in the hallway outside that half-open door for a long time after he stopped speaking. She wasn't sure how long. Long enough for her to understand that the devastation she felt wasn't grief exactly. It was something colder. It was the recognition of something she had been too careful not to see. She had been useful, and now she wasn't, and that was the whole of it. So when the attorneys slid the papers across the table tonight, Nia didn't cry. She didn't argue. She reached for the pen and she signed every page with the same legible, unhurried signature she'd been writing since she was 12 years old. Tae-jun watched her. She couldn't read his expression, and she'd stopped trying months ago. When she finished, she capped the pen and set it down parallel to the stack. She stood up. She pulled the wedding band from her finger, a thin platinum ring with a single channel set diamond, understated by Tae-jun's standards, chosen because she'd asked for something she could wear to work without it catching on things. And she placed it on the table beside his untouched glass of whiskey. She didn't say anything. She picked up her coat and her bag and she walked to the elevator. Behind her, she heard nothing. No footsteps. No voice. The attorneys were quiet. Tae-jun was quiet. The storm hammered the windows. The elevator opened. She stepped inside. In the last second before the doors closed, she allowed herself one look back. Tae-jun was still standing where he'd been standing, glass in hand, watching her leave with the same composed expression he wore to every meeting where something was being finalized and done. The doors closed. The elevator descended. Nia stood with her back against the wall and both hands pressed flat against the cool metal behind her, and she breathed. In through her nose, out through her mouth. In, out. The way her grandmother had taught her when she was small and the world felt too big and too loud. She made it to the lobby before her legs started to shake. She made it to the sidewalk before the cold hit her. She did not make it to her cousin's apartment building, 9 blocks away, before she had to stop and sit on the concrete steps of a closed laundromat in the rain and grip the wrought iron railing and just breathe until the shaking stopped. She sat there for 11 minutes. She knew because she counted. Then she got up and kept walking. Nia Whitaker was 26, 3 years younger than Nia, and she occupied a 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that had a broken buzzer on the front door and a landlord who believed heat was optional in October. She taught middle school music, and she kept her refrigerator stocked with things that had no business being in a refrigerator: candles, nail polish, a set of socket wrenches that she'd borrowed from someone and forgotten to return. She was not organized. She was not calm. She was exactly what Nia needed. When Nia knocked at 11:40 that night, dripping wet and carrying a single bag of clothes, Imani opened the door, took one look at her and said, "I'll make the couch up." She didn't ask what happened. She didn't say she'd always had a bad feeling about him. She went to the linen closet and got sheets, and she made up the couch, and she brought Nia a towel and a dry sweatshirt and a bowl of reheated rice, and she sat on the floor beside the couch while Nia ate it and didn't say one single word until Nia was ready to talk. That was the thing about Imani. She understood that some nights, the kindest thing you could offer someone was just your presence and your silence. Nia talked until 2 in the morning. She talked about the hallway outside the study, about the attorneys, about the ring on the table, about the elevator. She talked about the ways she'd spent 3 years adjusting herself, the things she hadn't said in rooms full of his associates, the clothes she'd learned to wear, the topics she'd learned to avoid, the version of herself she'd slowly built around what Tae-jun's world needed her to be. "I thought it was compromise," she said. "I kept telling myself it was just what marriage is. You adjust. You make room." Imani was quiet for a moment. "How much room did he make for you?" Nia looked at the ceiling. She didn't answer. They both already knew. The first 2 weeks were the strangest. Nia had known, intellectually, that Tae-jun's protection had insulated her from ordinary civilian life in ways she hadn't fully registered while she was inside it. She understood that in theory. She had not fully understood it as a felt, daily, concrete reality until the morning after she moved into Imani's apartment and took the bus for the first time in 3 years. She got on the wrong one. She rode it 6 stops past where she needed to be before she realized. She had to ask a teenager in a school uniform how to get back, and the girl looked at her phone and told her with a bored patience that made Nia feel simultaneously grateful and 20 years older than she was. She found a job within the week, waitressing at a breakfast diner that opened at 5:30 in the morning and closed at 2 in the afternoon. The work was physical and fast, and the manager, a compact Haitian woman named Claudette, ran the kitchen like she was conducting a symphony and had no patience for people who couldn't keep up. Nia was slow the first 3 days. Then she wasn't. The morning sickness started on a Thursday. It was subtle at first. A tightness in her stomach before she'd eaten anything. A sensitivity to the smell of the cooking grease that floated out from the kitchen. She told herself it was adjustment, a new schedule, bad sleep, the cumulative weight of everything she was carrying. Then one morning, she had to walk out mid-shift to stand in the alley behind the diner and grip the brick wall and breathe through something that was not going to pass as quickly as she needed it to. Claudette found her out there, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and watched Nia for a moment. "You pregnant?" Nia started to say no. She stopped. She bought a test on her lunch break. 2 tests. She took them both in the bathroom of a coffee shop 3 blocks from the diner, standing in a stall that smelled like industrial cleaner and old tile. And she looked at the results, and she looked at them again, and she sat down on the lid of the toilet with her coat still on and her bag still over her shoulder, and she stared at the white tile floor for a very long time. She ran the math in her head. The timing. She already knew the answer before she finished running it. The baby was Tae-jun's. She sat there until someone knocked on the stall door. Then she got up, wrapped both tests in paper towel, buried them at the bottom of her bag, washed her hands, and walked back to work. She told Imani that night. Imani went very still. That was how Nia knew she understood the weight of it. Not just the pregnancy, but the specific gravity of whose baby it was. What that name meant. What it could mean in the wrong hands to the wrong people. Does he know? No. Are you going to tell him? Nia had already been turning that question over for 7 hours. She'd thought about what a call to Tae-jun would look like. She'd thought about the attorney who would appear within 48 hours. She'd thought about what the CO organization would do with knowledge that there was an heir. She'd thought about what Tae-jun's rivals would do with that same knowledge. She'd thought about a child growing up inside a world made of guarded rooms and careful silences and exits that were never really free. No, she said. Imani didn't argue. She reached across the small kitchen table and put her hand over Nia's. Then we figure it out. The months that followed were the hardest thing Nia had ever done, and she had done hard things. The diner job stayed. She picked up a second shift cleaning offices for a property management company, 4 nights a week, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. On the 2 nights she wasn't cleaning offices, she picked up babysitting jobs through a neighborhood app, sitting with the sleeping children of young couples who needed 3 hours of uninterrupted time and were willing to pay for it. She saved everything she could. She kept a small envelope of cash in a cutout space inside the back cover of a hardback book on Imani's shelf, behind a row of other books, because some part of her understood that digital money could be traced and paper money could not. She didn't think Tae-jun was looking, but she didn't know he wasn't. The baking started by accident. Imani's birthday was in February. Nia didn't have enough money to buy anything significant, and she needed to do something. Needed the specific satisfaction of making something with her own hands for someone who had given her a couch, and her silence and her presence without being asked. She pulled out a recipe her grandmother had written on an index card in the rounded, deliberate handwriting of someone who learned penmanship when it was still taught seriously. Yellow cake with brown buttercream cheese frosting. She made it in Imani's kitchen on a Saturday morning. It was not perfect. The layers were slightly uneven. She'd over-whipped the frosting at one point and had to rescue it. But it tasted exactly right, the way it had tasted every birthday of her childhood, the particular sweetness of something made from memory. A neighbor knocked that afternoon, drawn by the smell of butter and warm cake through the hallway. Imani's neighbor from across the hall, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Patricia Odom, who stood in the doorway in her housecoat and asked with complete seriousness whether Nia had been professionally trained. Nia had laughed, genuinely, for the first time in weeks. "No, ma'am, just my grandmother's recipe." Mrs. Odom ordered 2 dozen cupcakes for her granddaughter's birthday party the following weekend. She paid $40. Then she told her friend, who told her daughter, who reached out through Imani for a baby shower order. By the time Zora came, and Zora came on a Tuesday in late July, in the middle of a heat wave, in a public hospital where Nia labored for 19 hours with Imani holding her hand on one side and a labor nurse named Denise on the other, Denise, who had the unhurried steadiness of someone who had been in this room 1,000 times and intended to be there 1,000 more. The baking had become something Nia could no longer fully call a side thing. The moment she heard Zora cry, Nia's whole body simply stopped. Just for a second. Everything she'd been carrying for the past month suspended itself. Then Denise placed the baby against her chest, and Nia looked down, and Zora opened her eyes, and Nia felt the air leave her lungs in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Gray eyes. Dark, unfocused, brand new gray eyes. The specific gray of a winter sky just before the snow starts. The same eyes that had watched Nia sign those papers without blinking. Nia held her daughter against her and pressed her lips to the top of that small, damp, dark-haired head. She was shaking. She was laughing. She was crying so hard she could barely see, and she had promised herself in that elevator 8 months ago that she would not cry. She named her Zora. Zora Whitaker. Her mother's maiden name, her grandmother's spirit, nothing connected to the CO organization or its world or its reach. She looked at her daughter's face and made one promise, simple, specific, permanent. You will never grow up behind guarded walls. Outside, Chicago went about its business in the summer heat. Somewhere on the other side of the city, in a penthouse on the 53rd floor, Tae-jun was conducting his world as he always did, controlled, efficient, untouchable. He had no idea that his daughter had just taken her first breath. And in that gap, between what he knew and what he didn't, Nia Whitaker began, slowly and without anyone's permission, to build something he would never be able to take from her. Zora was 2 years and 4 months old the first time she climbed out of her toddler bed by herself. Nia heard the thud, not a falling thud, a deliberate one, both feet hitting the floor with purpose, and was already sitting up before she was fully awake. She found Zora standing in the middle of the small bedroom they shared, completely upright, looking at the window where the early morning light was doing something interesting against the curtains. "Zoo," Nia said. Her voice was still thick with sleep. "It's 5 in the morning." Zora turned around. Those gray eyes found Nia's face with the particular directness that still, after 2 years, caught Nia off guard every single time. "The light is doing a thing," Zora said. Nia sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the curtains. The light was doing a thing, a faint amber strip where the sun was just beginning to push through the gap at the bottom. "Yeah," Nia said. "It is." She didn't go back to sleep after that. She rarely did once she was up. Instead, she moved to the kitchen and started the coffee and stood with both hands on the counter while it brewed, listening to Zora narrate something to herself in the other room. And she did the math she did every morning. A reflex now, like checking the weather. The catering invoice for the Kellerman anniversary dinner was due to clear today. Supplies for the Donovan corporate breakfast were running about $60 over what she'd budgeted because the good vanilla had gone up again. Amani's rent contribution for the month was 2 weeks from now, which meant the small buffer Nia kept in the cutout book wasn't moving yet. Aurelia Private Events was 14 months old. That name had come to her in the middle of a 3 a.m. baking session, flour on her forearms, Zora asleep in the next room, Amani's apartment smelling like browned butter and cardamom. Aurelia. She'd looked it up afterward. It meant golden. She'd written it on a napkin and left it on the counter, and in the morning it still felt right, which was the only test she applied to anything anymore. The business had started with Mrs. Odom's cupcakes and a $40 payment and a word-of-mouth chain that Nia had not engineered and could not fully explain. What she could explain was that she worked with a precision and a discretion that people noticed. She was never late. She never overpromised. When something went wrong, and things went wrong, always, in the food and events business, she absorbed it without drama and fixed it without making the client feel the weight of the fix. That quality, she understood, was rare. Wealthy people particularly noticed it because wealthy people were accustomed to being managed around rather than genuinely served. By the time Zora was walking steadily, Aurelia had served 43 clients. By the time Zora was saying full sentences, Aurelia had a waiting list. Nia hired her first employee at the 18-month mark, a culinary school graduate named Deja, 23 years old, fast and opinionated, who showed up to the interview in a chef's coat she'd clearly just ironed and told Nia that she worked best when she was given a clear brief and then left alone to execute it. Nia hired her on the spot. That was the quality she needed from everyone around her now. People who could operate without being managed. People who could close the gap between instruction and execution without asking for hand-holding. She could not afford hand-holding. She did not have the bandwidth. The morning the Whitmore Group contract arrived in her email, Nia was at the commercial kitchen she rented by the hour in a building on West Kinsey, working through a test menu for a private dinner. Deja was across the counter, reducing something that smelled like dark cherry and red wine, occasionally tasting from a spoon and frowning at the ceiling in the focused way she had. Nia read the email twice on her phone, then set the phone face down on the counter, then picked it up and read it again. The Whitmore Group, Korean American Investment and Private Holdings Corporation, one of the most established institutional names in Chicago's upper financial tier. They wanted to discuss a multi-event hospitality contract, a full calendar year of executive dinners, investor presentations, private receptions, and 2 large-scale corporate celebrations. The number in the preliminary budget line made Nia's chest tighten. "You okay?" Deja said, without looking up from her reduction. "Yeah. You're doing that thing where you go very still." "I'm reading an email." "You read emails like other people receive medical diagnoses." Nia put the phone back down. She picked up her knife and went back to work. She would look at the contract properly tonight, after Zora was asleep, when she could sit with it and think clearly without the background noise of the kitchen and the low, steady hum of anxiety that lived in her chest these days like a permanent tenant. She looked it up that night. Sat at Imani's kitchen table their kitchen table now, Imani insisted on the possessive, with Zora's drawings spread across half the surface and her laptop open on the other half. She typed the full name of the company into her browser. She read the first result, then the second. The Whitmore Group had been established 12 years ago as a legitimate commercial vehicle for a network of Korean American investment interests. It operated across real estate, private equity, and hospitality holdings in Chicago, New York, and Seoul. It had a clean public profile, filings in order, press releases about charitable involvement, a board of directors whose names appeared occasionally in business section profiles. The name at the top of the ownership structure was listed as a holding company. The name of the holding company was CO Holdings International. Nia closed the laptop. She sat in the silence of the kitchen for a long time. From the other room came the sound of Zora breathing, the particular rhythm of a small child in deep sleep, even and slow, with that occasional catch that meant she was dreaming. Nia thought about walking away from the contract. She ran that option fully, the email she would send, the professionally vague reason she would give. The Whitmore Group was large enough and busy enough that a declined bid from a mid-size hospitality company wouldn't register. They would move to the next name on their list, but walking away had its own risks. A company that had specifically sought out Aurelia, that had found her somehow, through which referral chain she didn't yet know, might find it strange if she declined without a meeting, might make a note, might ask questions. She didn't want questions. She had never wanted questions. She opened the laptop again and sent a reply confirming a preliminary meeting. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and understood that she had just agreed to walk back into the proximity of the one thing she'd spent 2 years and 4 months systematically putting between herself and everything connected to Seo Tae-jun. She didn't sleep well. She didn't expect to. The meeting was on a Wednesday, 10th floor of a building in the Loop, conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river running gray below. Nia wore a charcoal blazer and kept her natural hair close-cropped the way she'd started wearing it after Zora was born. Practical, clean, no maintenance she didn't have time for. She carried a presentation folder and a portfolio of Aurelia's work, and she arrived 7 minutes early, which was when she always arrived, because she needed those 7 minutes to be in the room before anyone else, to place herself, to know the exits. The Whitmore Group's hospitality liaison was a woman named Sandra, mid-40s, efficient, with the pleasant professional affect of someone who had spent many years being the person who made things run smoothly for people who never noticed. Nia liked her immediately. They went through the contract framework, the calendar, the scope. Nia asked the questions she needed to ask and answered the ones Sandra had in the deliberate, measured way she'd learned. Enough information to be credible, not so much that you gave away your full hand. Everything was going smoothly, and the way things go smoothly right before they don't. The conference room door opened. Nia knew before she turned her head. She felt it first, the particular pressure of a room adjusting to a presence that commanded adjustment. The way people's posture shifted slightly. The way Sandra straightened almost imperceptibly. The way the air in the room seemed to reorganize itself around a new center of gravity. She turned her head. Tae-jun stood in the doorway. He was wearing a navy suit, not charcoal, navy, darker and more deliberate. And he looked exactly like he had always looked, controlled, present, and completely untouchable. He was 36 now. 2 years hadn't changed him in any way she could point to specifically. Maybe a degree more stillness around the eyes, maybe something slightly harder in the set of his jaw. His eyes found her in approximately 1 second. She watched him process it. She had the advantage there. She'd had weeks to prepare for this moment, and he'd had no time at all. She watched the recognition arrive, and then she watched him absorb it with the same composed efficiency he applied to every unexpected development, and then she watched him look at her in a way that was not quite the way he had looked at her before. She stood up, extended her hand across the table. "Mr. Seo." A beat. One full beat of silence. He crossed the room and shook her hand. His grip was the same, firm, brief, complete. "Ms. Whitaker." That was all. Sandra was already making introductions, explaining Nia's company, describing the meeting's progress. Tae-jun pulled out a chair and sat down and turned his attention to Sandra with a focus that looked total. Nia sat back down and did the same thing, turned her attention back to the contract, back to the scope, back to the work. Under the table, her right hand was pressed flat against her thigh, and she was counting her own breaths the way her grandmother had taught her. She made it through the rest of the meeting. She made it to the elevator before her hands started to shake. Imani was awake when Nia got home. She was sitting on the couch with a stack of student sheet music and a red pen, marking up quarter-note errors with the specific long-suffering patience of a teacher who had been correcting the same mistakes for a decade. She looked up when Nia came through the door and read Nia's face in the instantaneous way she'd always been able to. "What happened?" Nia set her bag down by the door, took off her blazer, sat on the other end of the couch. "He was there." Imani went completely still. "At the meeting?" "Yes." "Did he, no, he was professional. So was I." Nia looked at her own hands. The shaking had mostly stopped. "He didn't know I was going to be there. I could tell." Imani put down the sheet music. "Nia." "I know." "You need to pull the contract. If I pull it now, after he's seen my face, it looks like I'm running." "You would be running. That's fine. Running is a legitimate response to—" "I can't run anymore, Imani." Nia said it quietly. Not with heat, just with the flat certainty of someone who had fully thought through what was on the other side of that sentence. "I have run. I ran for 2 years. I built something. I can't keep building it around the shape of what I'm avoiding." Imani was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Zora." "He doesn't know." There was nothing in his face. If Kwan had found anything, Tae-jun would know how to hide it. But he doesn't hide things the same way I do. I know the difference. "You used to know the difference." Nia looked at her cousin. Imani was staring back with the kind of expression that meant she was choosing to say the difficult thing because she loved Nia too much not to. "You used to know a lot of things about him," Imani said, "and then it turned out you didn't." That landed. Nia didn't deflect it. "I know," she said again, "but I'm not walking away from this contract because of him. I'm taking it because it's the right move for Aurelia, and I'm going to handle whatever comes with it." Imani picked up her sheet music, went back to the quarter notes. "You're going to handle it," she repeated, not as a question. "Yes." "Okay." Imani drew a firm red circle around a misplaced rest. "Then I need you to also handle the fact that Zora has been asking why her eyes are a different color than yours." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence entirely. Nia had been waiting for that question for 2 years. She'd constructed various answers, tested them mentally against the particular logic of a small child, revised them. She knew it was coming. Knowing it was coming and hearing that it had arrived were 2 completely different experiences. "What did you tell her?" Nia asked. "I told her some people just have different eyes, and that her eyes were very beautiful, and she said, 'I know,' like a completely unbothered little person, and then asked me for a snack." Imani looked up. "But she's going to ask you next. And she's going to ask with more specificity. She's 2. She's almost 3, and she is not a typical almost 3. You know that. Nia did know that. She sat with it until Imani went to bed. Then she went quietly into the bedroom and stood in the dark and watched Zora sleep. The rise and fall of her small chest, the way she'd kicked one leg out from under the blanket in the particular configuration she always slept in, the dark hair fanned out against the pillow. Those gray eyes were closed. Nia reached out and tucked the blanket back over Zora's leg. Stood there another moment. She thought about Tae-jun across that conference table, the way he'd looked at her, not like she was a problem to be solved. Something else. Something she hadn't fully categorized yet and didn't want to spend time on. She thought about the contract, the calendar year of events, the number in the preliminary budget line. She thought about what Aurelia could do with that number. The commercial kitchen space she could finally stop renting by the hour. The second employee she could bring on properly. The professional training program she'd been sketching on napkins for months. The idea that had started as something abstract and kept coming back with more detail, more shape, more pull. She thought about Zora asking why her eyes were a different color. She pressed her lips together, breathed through her nose. Then she went back to the kitchen table and opened her laptop and started preparing her formal bid. The following weeks had the particular texture of walking very carefully across ice, each step deliberate, each footfall tested before committing weight. Tae-jun appeared at 3 more preparatory meetings under the stated justification that the contract represented a significant corporate investment and he preferred direct oversight of key vendor relationships. It was a plausible reason. It was also, Nia understood completely, not the actual reason. She was professional at every meeting. She was precise, prepared, unhurried. She answered his questions with the exactness they deserved. She did not give him more than the question asked for. He was watching her. She could feel it, not in an aggressive way, not the way an enemy watches, but in the unsettled way of someone trying to reconcile 2 versions of the same person and finding the current version more difficult to read than they expected. After the 3rd meeting, he appeared in the hallway outside the elevator. Not by accident. The Whitmore Group's offices were on one floor. He'd come down from another. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Not a question. A statement delivered as one. "You can ask," Nia said. "You knew the Whitmore Group's ownership structure when you agreed to this contract." She looked at him evenly. "I did my due diligence, yes." "So you knew I was the principal?" "I knew the holding company's name, which you knew was mine." "Mr. Seo," she said, "do you have a question about the hospitality contract or why did you take it?" She held his gaze for a full 3 seconds. She'd counted. She'd learned to count things in these conversations because counting kept her mind organized and her face neutral. Because the scope of work matched Aurelia's capabilities, the budget was appropriate, and the timeline was workable. She pressed the elevator button. "Is there a concern about delivery?" "No." "Then I'll see you at the prep review on Thursday." The elevator opened. She got in. He did not follow. Standing in that elevator, Nia exhaled through her teeth and looked at her own reflection in the polished metal doors as they closed. She looked composed. She looked like a woman who had somewhere to be and was moving efficiently toward it. She did not look like a woman who had a 2-year-old with his eyes sleeping 9 miles away in a borrowed bedroom in a 3rd-floor apartment with a broken front buzzer. She intended to keep it that way. But the thing about intentions, the thing Nia understood better now than she had at 26, before all of this, before the hallway outside the study, and the stack of papers, and the elevator, and the laundromat steps, and the positive pregnancy test in the coffee shop bathroom, was that intentions were the plan, and the plan was never the whole story. Kwanmin Seok had been watching Nia Whitaker since the 2nd week of her first Whitmore Group meeting. He hadn't told Tae-jun he was doing it. That was the thing about Kwan. He operated at the level of anticipating needs rather than responding to stated ones. Tae-jun had not said, "Find out about Nia." But Kwan had watched Tae-jun's face in that first conference room, had watched the particular quality of stillness that moved across it when the doors opened and Nia stood at the head of the table. And Kwan had understood without being told that this was a situation requiring attention. Kwan was 41, lean, with the kind of face that was difficult to remember after you'd left a room. He was not threatening in any obvious physical sense. He was threatening in the way a precise mechanism is threatening, quietly functional, with very little wasted movement. He had been with the CO organization for 11 years. He knew where everything was and where everything had been. He hired a private research firm. Discreet, professional, used to gathering information on individuals without leaving fingerprints on the process. He gave them Nia's maiden name, her last known Chicago address at the time of the separation, and a date range. They came back to him in 11 days. He sat with the report in his office for 2 hours before he made any decision about what to do with it. Employment records. First, the diner, the office cleaning company, various babysitting and catering receipts, the formation of Aurelia Private Events as an LLC with Nia listed as sole owner and operator, the commercial kitchen rental agreements, the growing client list, a profile piece in a mid-tier Chicago business publication from 8 months ago, emerging voices in Chicago's luxury hospitality sector, with a photograph of Nia standing in front of a table she'd arranged for a private dinner, looking directly at the camera with the kind of expression that people who didn't know what she'd come from would simply read as confidence. Kwon looked at that photograph for a long time. Then he turned to the second section of the report. Medical records were harder to obtain cleanly. The firm had navigated it through a combination of public record cross-referencing and sources Kwon preferred not to examine too closely. What they produced was a documented hospital admission, a public facility on the south side, and a birth record dated in late July, approximately 8 months after Nia Whitaker had signed the separation agreement. A live birth, female, named Zora Whitaker. Kwon read the details of the birth record. He noted the father line on the certificate. It was blank. He sat with that for a long time. Then he did the arithmetic that anyone with access to the separation date and the birth date would eventually do. 8 months. Nia had signed the papers in November. Zora was born the following July. She had been pregnant when Tae-jun exiled her. Kwon did not move from his desk for several minutes after completing that calculation. He was not a sentimental man. He was not given to emotional responses to information. But he was a man who understood consequence, who had spent 11 years mapping the relationship between actions and their outcomes. And the consequence of this particular piece of information was not small. He picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. Then he prepared a summary and scheduled a private meeting with Tae-jun for the following evening. Tae-jun read the report standing up. Kwon had placed it on the desk and taken a seat and said nothing, which was how Kwon always delivered information he was uncertain how to frame. He let the document speak first and held himself available for whatever came after. Tae-jun read it standing at the window, his back to Kwon, the Chicago skyline spread out before him in the particular way it looked at 8 in the evening in early autumn, lit up and enormous and indifferent. He read the employment records. He read the business formation documents. He read the profile piece. He paused at the photograph. He turned the page. He read the birth record. Kwon watched his shoulders. They didn't move. Nothing moved. Tae-jun stood at the window and read the document with the same external stillness he brought to everything. And Kwon watched the shoulders and waited for the tell, the small physical signal that something had arrived in the body before the mind had fully processed it. There, the left shoulder. A barely perceptible tightening. Tae-jun turned back to the birth date. He looked at it again. He did the arithmetic. Kwon watched him do it, watched the quality of stillness shift from composed to something else, something without a clean name, something that moved through a man when he understood that a calculation he'd believed was finished had never been finished at all. The room was very quiet. Her name, Tae-jun said. His voice was level. That was the most unsettling thing about it, how level it remained. Zora. Yes. She's 2. 2 years and 4 months based on the birth date. Another silence. The father line is blank. Yes. Tae-jun set the report down on the desk with a care that was more controlled than gentleness. He walked to the window and stood with his hands behind his back and looked at the city. Kwon said nothing. He'd learned long ago that the most useful thing he could do in moments like this was simply remain present and not fill the silence with words that would only get in the way. Tae-jun stood at that window for 4 minutes. Then he said, "Get me her current address." Tae-jun, not for what you're thinking. His voice was still level, but something had entered it, a quality Kwon hadn't heard before, or hadn't heard in this particular combination with those particular words. I want to know where she is, that's all. Kwon looked at the back of his head, at the set of those shoulders. I'll have it by morning, he said. He left the office. He closed the door behind him. He stood in the corridor for a moment, the report in his hand, and he thought about the photograph of Nia Whitaker standing at a dinner table she'd arranged herself, looking at the camera like she had nothing left to prove to anyone. And he thought about the blank line on a birth certificate where a father's name should have been. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there while it descended, and for the first time in 11 years of working for Seo Tae-jun, Kwon Min Seok did not entirely know what came next. Tae-jun drove himself. That alone should have told Kwon something if Kwon had been watching, which he wasn't, because Tae-jun had left the building through the parking structure at 6:15 in the morning, before anyone on his security detail was expecting movement, before the day had officially begun. He took the black sedan that lived in the second basement level, the one registered to a shell holding company, 3 removes from the SEO name, the one he kept specifically for occasions when he needed to be somewhere that no one in his organization could account for. He'd memorized the address the night before. He didn't put it in his phone. It took him 23 minutes to reach the South Side neighborhood. He found street parking half a block from the building, a 3-story brick apartment structure with a wrought iron front door and a buzzer panel that, he noticed as he drove past, had a piece of tape across one of the buttons with the word "broken" written on it in permanent marker. He parked and turned the engine off and sat. The neighborhood was the particular kind of quiet that early autumn mornings produced, not empty, but unhurried. A man walked a small dog. An older woman in a heavy coat moved toward the bus stop at the corner with the measured pace of someone who had been taking the same route for 20 years. 2 children in school uniforms emerged from the building across the street and immediately began arguing about something with the wholehearted energy that only children arguing about something entirely inconsequential could generate. Tae-jun sat with his hands on the steering wheel and looked at the building with the broken buzzer and said nothing to no one. He had not slept. He'd known while it was still happening that he wouldn't sleep, had gone to bed anyway because the discipline of lying down and closing his eyes at the appropriate hour was one of the routines he refused to relinquish, even when everything else was unraveling. He'd stared at the ceiling of his penthouse and turned the arithmetic over in his head the way he'd been unable to stop turning it over since Kwon had left the office. 8 months. Nia had signed the papers in November. Zora was born the following July. He'd run the sequence again and again, each time arriving at the same landing point, not because he doubted the math, but because some part of him kept expecting the calculation to change if he repeated it enough times. It didn't change. At 6:03 in the morning, a door on the building's second floor opened, and a small figure in a red jacket came out onto the exterior landing. Not a proper balcony, just a landing at the top of a metal staircase that ran down the side of the building. The figure was too small to be anyone but a very young child. Zora. She gripped the railing with both hands and looked out at the street below with the focused curiosity of someone surveying a territory. Tae-jun went very still. From inside, a voice. Nia's voice, though he couldn't hear the words, just the cadence, the particular rhythm of a mother calling a child back from somewhere she shouldn't be. Zora turned toward the door and said something back. Then she came inside. The door closed. Tae-jun sat there for another 40 minutes. Nothing happened. The neighborhood continued its morning. The bus came and went. The dog walker returned without the dog and with a coffee cup instead. He started the engine and drove back to the city. By the time he arrived at the Whitmore Group offices for the 9 o'clock meeting he'd been scheduled for since the previous week, he had rebuilt enough of his composure that Sandra noted nothing unusual, and his 2 senior investment advisors noted nothing unusual, and the attorney who joined them at 10 noticed nothing unusual. Only Kwon noticed. Kwon noticed because Kwon spent 11 years learning to read the things that Tae-jun's composure was designed to conceal. He noticed the way Tae-jun's left hand rested on the table with slightly too much stillness. He noticed that Tae-jun had not touched his coffee. He noticed that twice during the meeting, when the discussion drifted and didn't require Tae-jun's active engagement, something moved through his eyes. Not grief exactly, not anger exactly, something that Kwon, who was not a sentimental man, found himself without the right word for. After the meeting cleared, Kwon stayed behind. "You went," he said. "That's not your concern." "I'm making it my concern." Tae-jun looked at him. It was a look that in another context, with another person, would have ended the conversation. Kwon met it without moving. She had a child on that landing this morning, Tae-jun said. The sentence came out flat, carefully maintained. Red jacket. She was holding the railing with both hands. Kwon said nothing. She looked like... Tae-jun stopped, started again. She had the same way of holding on to something. The grip. It's the same. Tae-jun. I know. He picked up his coffee, set it back down without drinking it. I know what you're going to say. I'm not going to say anything, Kwon said. I'm going to ask you what you intend to do. Because what you intend to do will have consequences either way, and I need to understand which set of consequences I'm managing. The silence between them was the specific kind that two men who had operated together for 11 years could occupy without discomfort. It was a working silence. A silence that meant something was being genuinely considered rather than performed. I don't know yet, Tae-jun said finally. Kwon nodded. Then I'd suggest you know before Thursday's meeting. He left. Tae-jun stayed at the table alone, looking at the river through the floor-to-ceiling windows, gray and moving and indifferent to everything happening above it. Nia noticed the change in him on Thursday. She noticed it the way she noticed most things about Tae-jun. Not through what was visible, but through the quality of what he was withholding. He was present in the meeting, engaged, asking the right questions in the right order. But there was something operating behind the professional surface that hadn't been there in the previous meetings. Something that made the air in the room feel slightly different when his attention landed on her. She held her ground. She had practiced holding her ground in rooms where the pressure was coming from directions other people in the room couldn't see. After Sandra wrapped the agenda and the other attendees began collecting their materials, Tae-jun said, 5 minutes. Sandra looked at him, then at Nia, and read something in the room correctly enough to say, I'll get the revised timeline printed and leave. The door closed. Nia did not sit back down. She stayed standing with her portfolio in her hands and her bag over her shoulder. Not aggressively, not like she was preparing to leave immediately, but in the way of someone who had made a conscious decision about which position gave them the most options. You look well, Tae-jun said. Thank you. I don't mean it as a pleasantry. I know you don't. She looked at him steadily. What's the 5 minutes for? He was quiet for a moment. She watched him working through something, some sequence of words being measured against each other, being tested for weight and consequence. That was a thing she'd learned to recognize in him, late in the marriage. The pause before he said something he'd been deciding whether to say. When did you start the company? He asked. The LLC was filed about 14 months after the separation. And before that? Before that I worked. She kept her voice even. The way people work when they need money and don't have other options. Nia, is this relevant to the Whitmore contract? He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly. Not yet. But the forerunner of it. The moment before a man understands the full shape of what he's done. No, he said. Then I'll see you at the next review. She moved toward the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, looked back. The hospitality execution for the December investor dinner is going to require early access to the venue. I'll need Sandra to authorize that by end of next week. She left without waiting for his response. In the elevator, she pressed her thumb hard against the seam of her portfolio folder and counted floors. 12, 11, 10. The shaking in her hands was less than it had been at the first meeting. That was something. The fact that she was still shaking it all was also something, but she'd gotten very practiced at deciding which things she was going to worry about and which ones she was going to set aside until she had the capacity to deal with them. Zora was at daycare. She had a pickup at 4:15. She had supply orders to confirm before 3. She had a tasting menu to finalize by Friday. She had a meeting with a contract attorney the following week, an appointment she'd scheduled the day after she'd accepted the Whitmore bid, because whatever she felt about Tae-jun's proximity in this situation, the one thing she was absolutely certain of was that Aurelia needed its legal footing checked and reinforced before she walked any further into this arrangement. She had things to do. She did them. The contract attorney's name was Margaret Osei, 47, meticulous, with the particular quality of attention that expensive, detail-oriented legal work produced in people over time. Nia had found her through a referral from a client, and Margaret had come with 2 other referrals from women who'd described her with the same words. She doesn't miss things. They met in Margaret's office on a Tuesday afternoon. Nia had brought every document related to the Whitmore contract. The initial bid correspondence, the preliminary scope, the draft terms she'd received the previous week. She laid them out on Margaret's desk and watched Margaret read through them with the focused silence of someone looking for the thing that wasn't immediately obvious. "The indemnification clause in Section 7, Margaret said, without looking up. "I saw that. It's broad. Unusually broad for a hospitality vendor agreement. It creates exposure for Aurelia in situations that are well outside your operational control." She looked up. "Do you know why they'd want language this wide?" "I have a theory." Margaret looked at her with the particular patience of a woman who'd been waiting for the full picture and understood that it was coming at its own pace. Nia told her. Not everything, not Zora, not the specific nature of what Tae-jun's organization was, not the history of the marriage in any personal detail. But enough. The ownership structure, the principal's identity, the fact that this was not an arm's-length commercial relationship. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Nia finished, she set her pen down. "You're working for your ex-husband." "I'm working for a company he owns." "Same thing in this context." Margaret looked at the documents again. "Do you want my honest assessment?" "That's what I'm paying for." "The contract as written puts Aurelia in a position where its performance and reputation become tied to this organization's public standing. If there is ever legal or regulatory action against the Whitmore Group or its parent holding structure, Aurelia's contractual entanglement could become a liability regardless of your own conduct." Nia had known this. Hearing it said aloud by someone whose job was to know these things precisely was different from knowing it herself. "So I should exit the contract," she said. I didn't say that." Margaret tapped his documents. "I said the contract as written creates that exposure. That's a negotiation problem, not necessarily a walkaway problem. If we can get Section 7 amended, the termination clause in Section 12 modified, and a clean severability provision added, the legal risk becomes manageable." She paused. "The other risk is harder to legislate." Nia looked at her. "The personal history," Margaret said, simply and without judgment. "I'm managing that." "I don't doubt it." Margaret gathered the documents into a neat stack. "I'll draft the amendment request this week. You'll want to present them as standard commercial terms, which they are, rather than anything that signals you've had legal counsel review specifically for this relationship." "Understood." "And Miss Whitaker," Margaret looked at her directly, "whatever you're protecting outside the business, make sure you have that protected separately. The contract amendments can cover Aurelia. They can't cover everything." Nia drove home from that meeting with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. Make sure you have that protected separately. She'd been running the variables around Zora for 2.5 years. In the beginning, it had been raw survival-level risk assessment. Keep moving, keep hidden, don't create a trail. That phase had worked. She was no longer hidden, but hidden had never been a permanent solution. She'd understood that. Hidden was a bridge strategy. What she hadn't fully worked through was the end of the bridge. That night, after Zora was asleep, Nia sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and started writing. Not formally, not in the organized way she managed Aurelia's operational documentation, but in the fast, unfiltered way she used when she needed to get the contents of her head outside of her head so she could see them. She wrote everything she knew about Tae-jun's operational structure and its relationship to legitimate entities. She wrote what she understood about how the CO organization responded to information about potential heirs. She wrote the various ways this situation could move, the directions it could go from the current position. She wrote what she would need to do legally to establish protective structure around Zora, regardless of what happened with the Whitmore contract or with Tae-jun personally. She filled 4 pages. She tore them up and ran water over the pieces in the sink until the ink bled out. Then she went to bed and stared at the ceiling until sometime around 3 in the morning. The phone call came 11 days later. Not from Tae-jun. From a number she didn't recognize, with a Chicago area code. She answered because unknown Chicago numbers sometimes meant clients, or suppliers, or the daycare calling from a staff member's personal phone. "Ms. Whitaker." A woman's voice. Controlled, professional. "My name is Hannah Park. I work for a private intelligence firm. I'd like to speak with you about a research commission we recently completed on your behalf." Nia's stomach dropped 3 floors. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice stayed level. "I don't know what you're referring to." I understand. A pause. The commission wasn't placed by you. It was placed by an entity associated with the CO organization. I'm calling because I believe you should know that the findings of that research have been delivered to a senior member of the organization. I'm calling you as a professional courtesy. The kitchen was very quiet. Nia was aware of the particular quality of the silence, the refrigerator's hum, the distant sound of a car passing outside, Zora's breathing from the other room. What did the research cover? Nia said. Still level. She was holding the phone so tightly she could feel her pulse in her palm. Another pause. Employment history, business formation records, medical documents. A beat. A birth record. The room didn't move. Nia didn't move. Who received the findings? She said. That I can't tell you. I've already exceeded the limits of what I'm able to share. But Ms. Whitaker, the timing of the delivery was approximately 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. Tae-jun had known for 2 weeks. He'd sat across from her in 2 meetings since then. He'd shaken her hand. He'd asked her about the December dinner venue access. He'd looked at her across a conference table and said, "You look well," and held his coffee without drinking it, and she had stood there reading the quality of what he was withholding, and she had filed it under something to monitor and moved on to the next thing on her list. He'd known for 2 weeks. "Thank you," Nia said. She didn't know why she said it. The woman hung up. Nia put the phone down on the kitchen table. She sat there. Imani came out of her bedroom in a sleep shirt, drawn by whatever quality of silence Nia was generating, the specific weight of it, the density. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Nia sitting at the table with her phone in front of her and her hands flat on the wood surface. "Nia." "He knows about Zora." Imani's hand found the doorframe. "How long?" 2 weeks. Nia heard the words coming out of her mouth. They sounded like someone else's words. "He's known for 2 weeks and he didn't. He sat in those meetings. He shook my hand." "Oh God. Stop." Nia's voice came out harder than she intended. "Don't. I need to think. I need to not." She pressed the heels of her hands against the table, pushed herself upright. "I need to think." "What does he know exactly?" "The birth record. That's enough. The timeline is there. The math isn't hard." She was moving now, not toward anything specific, just moving, because sitting still had become physically impossible. 2 weeks. He's had 2 weeks to make decisions, and I've been walking into those meetings without knowing. "We pack," Imani said. Her voice was very quiet and very firm. "We pack tonight, and we go where?" Nia turned to look at her. "Imani, Aurelia is here. The contract is here. My commercial kitchen relationship is here. My client list is here. Zora's daycare is here. If I run again, if you don't run and he decides to act on this, he hasn't acted." Nia stopped moving, stood in the middle of the kitchen. "He's known for 2 weeks, and he hasn't sent anyone. He hasn't called. He hasn't had an attorney contact me. He sat across from me and shook my hand and looked at me and didn't say a word." The sentence hung in the kitchen air. Both of them heard the implication inside it. Both of them understood that it could mean multiple things, and that the difference between those meanings was the difference between a situation that was survivable and one that was not. "I'm going to call Margaret in the morning," Nia said. "First thing, before the daycare drop-off. What can a contract attorney what's?" "She's not just a contract attorney. She has a network, and I need to understand my options legally around Zora before I walk into another room with him." She looked at Imani. "I'm not running, but I'm also not walking in blind anymore." Imani looked at her for a long moment. Then she went to the cabinet and took down 2 mugs and started heating water for tea with the deliberate movement of someone who needed to do something with their hands. "You said he shook your hand," Imani said, her back to Nia. "Yes." "And he looked at you?" "Yes." "And he asked about the venue access?" She turned around. Her face was careful, navigating something. "Nia, when Tae-jun has ever wanted to act on something, actually act, has he ever waited 2 weeks?" The question arrived in Nia's chest before it arrived in her mind. She thought about what she knew of Tae-jun's operational instincts, the speed and completeness with which he moved when he'd made a decision. She had never, in 3 years, seen him hold information and do nothing with it unless the nothing was itself a strategy. Every pause he ever took was purposeful. So what was the purpose of 2 weeks of nothing? She didn't answer Imani's question. She wasn't sure she had an answer. She stood in the kitchen while the water heated and the refrigerator hummed and her daughter breathed in the next room. And she understood with a cold, full-body clarity that the situation she was in had just fundamentally changed shape. She had built Aurelia around the space Tae-jun didn't occupy. She had constructed her entire life in the gap between what he knew and what he didn't. That gap was gone. She could not manage what she could not see. And for 2 weeks, without knowing it, she had been walking into rooms with a man who was holding the most critical piece of information in her life and choosing, for reasons she did not yet understand, to do nothing with it. That was either the most dangerous thing she'd ever faced or something else entirely. The problem was she couldn't tell which, and she had never, in all the ways she'd prepared herself for this moment, prepared herself for the possibility that the answer might not be either of the things she feared. Margaret Osei called back within the hour of Nia's early morning message, listened to the summary without interrupting, and said, "Come in at noon." Nia dropped Zora at daycare, watched her run toward the building's entrance with the red jacket half off one shoulder, watched her stop at the door and turn back and wave with her whole arm the way she always did, and felt something compress in her chest that had no name. She was willing to give it. She drove to Margaret's office. She sat across from a woman who did not miss things. She laid out the call, the 2-week gap, the meetings, the handshake, the nothing. Margaret listened. She wrote one thing on her legal pad. She looked at it. Then she looked at Nia. "You need to know what he intends before you take another step," she said. "Not what you fear he intends, what he actually intends. Because everything else, the legal structure, the protective filing, how you handle Aurelia's contract relationship, all of it depends on that one piece of information. How am I supposed to get that?" Margaret set her pen down. "You're going to have to ask him." The silence in the office was the most complete silence Nia had sat in since the elevator descended 53 floors 2.5 years ago. "You're telling me to go to Tae-jun directly. I'm telling you that you are already in a position where he holds critical information about you, and you are operating without knowing what he plans to do with it." Margaret's voice was measured and precise. "Right now, he has the advantage of knowing what you don't know he knows. The only way to close that gap is to step into the room and take it from him." Nia looked at the desk, at the legal pad, at the one line Margaret had written, which from this angle she couldn't read. She thought about the red jacket disappearing through the daycare door, the whole arm wave. She thought about 2 weeks of nothing. She thought about what kind of man sits on information like that and waits. And the only answer she kept arriving at, the one she'd been trying to avoid arriving at all morning, was the kind of man who is trying to figure out what the right thing to do is and doesn't yet know. Which was, she realized with a cold shock that moved from her sternum outward, the most dangerous version of Tae-jun she had ever had to contend with. She called him directly, not through Sandra, not through the Whitmore Group's hospitality liaison channel. She pulled up the number he'd given her at the first meeting, a direct line, offered with the professional neutrality of a principal making himself accessible to a key vendor, and she sat in her car in the parking structure beneath Margaret's building, and she called it. He picked up on the second ring. Nia. Not Ms. Whitaker. Not the careful professional register he'd maintained across every meeting for the past weeks. Just her name, said with a quality she couldn't fully read. Not surprise, not relief, not anything she had a clean word for. "I need to speak with you," she said. "Not in a meeting, not with Sandra in the next room." A silence. 3 seconds. "When?" "Today." Another silence, shorter. "There's a place on West Randolph, Marche Building, 4th floor, private dining room. I can have it cleared by 6. "I'll be there at 6. She hung up before he could say anything else, sat with the phone in her lap and breathed through her nose until her heart rate came down to something that felt manageable. Then she called Imani and told her she'd need to pick up Zora. She arrived at the address at 558. The building was the kind of place that didn't announce itself. No signage at street level, just a brass number plate and a door that opened when you pressed the intercom. A staff member met her in the lobby and took her up in an elevator that moved with the whisper-quiet efficiency of things that cost serious money to maintain. The 4th floor private dining room was a long rectangle with 3 windows looking west. Table set for 2, no other place settings visible. No staff in the room. A bar cart along one wall with glasses and a bottle of water and nothing else. She took the chair that faced the door. Tae-jun arrived at 6:01. He'd come from somewhere. His jacket was on, but no tie, and something in his posture had the residual tension of a long day not yet finished. He looked at her when he came through the door, the way he'd been looking at her since the first conference room. That quality of attention that was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. He closed the door behind him. He didn't sit immediately. He stood at the near end of the table with one hand resting on the back of a chair and looked at her across the distance of the room. "You know," Nia said, no preamble, no build-up. She was done with approach angles. "You've known for 2 weeks. I got a call this morning from someone at the research firm." She watched his jaw tighten, a small movement, quickly controlled. "I should have come to you directly," he said. "Yes, you should have." She kept her hands flat on the table, kept her voice even. "So why didn't you?" He pulled the chair out and sat down. He didn't lean back. He sat forward, elbows on the table, and looked at her in the way she remembered from the very early days of their marriage, before the organization consumed every room they occupied together, before she learned to read his silences as exits rather than thoughts. He'd had a quality of directness then that she'd trusted. She didn't know yet whether to trust it now. "Because every time I thought about how to start that conversation," he said, "I couldn't find a version of it that didn't begin with me having done something that couldn't be undone. It can't be undone." "No." "So you waited 2 weeks and shook my hand and asked about venue access." "I didn't know how to—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't have a frame for it. I've spent 20 years operating in situations where I understand the variables, where I know what I'm dealing with and I know what the options are." He looked at her. "I didn't know what I was dealing with." "You were dealing with the fact that I was pregnant when you signed those papers." The sentence landed in the room with the weight of something that had been carried a very long distance. Tae-jun didn't flinch. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, completely, into the stillness. "Yes," he said. "And you were dealing with the fact that you left me without security, without income, without anything, while I was carrying your child." "Yes." "And that I gave birth alone, in a public hospital, with your daughter, without you, because you decided I brought nothing useful to your organization." Each sentence was its own thing, separate, deliberate, placed in front of him with the precision of someone who had been carrying each one for 2.5 years and was finally setting them down somewhere permanent. Tae-jun sat across the table and took each one. He didn't defend himself. He didn't reach for context or explanation. She watched the impact move through him, and she understood, with a detachment she hadn't expected to feel, that this was not the composed indifference of a man who didn't care. It was the specific stillness of a man absorbing damage he knew he deserved. "Tell me about her," he said. Nia looked at him. "Not to claim anything," he said quickly. The quickness was involuntary, the first uncontrolled thing she'd seen from him. I'm not here to make demands. I need you to understand that first. What you need and what I choose to tell you are separate things." "I know." He pressed his hands flat on the table. His hands were steady. She knew from experience that they were always steady, regardless of what was happening behind his face. "Nia, I'm asking because she's—" He stopped again. "I drove to your street 6 days ago. I sat in the car. She came out onto the landing in a red jacket." Something moved through Nia's chest. Not warmth, not yet. Something more complicated than warmth, with harder edges. "You were watching my building. I sat in the car. I didn't approach. You were watching my building, Tae-jun." He heard it. The distinction she was making, the line between a grieving parent and a surveillance operation. He heard it, and it stopped him, and she could see him recalibrating. "Yes," he said quietly. "I was. I won't do it again." "No, you won't." She leaned forward slightly. "Because if I feel for 1 second that Zora's safety is uncertain, if anything about this situation moves in a direction that feels like a threat to her, I will take her and I will disappear. And this time you will not find us. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Say it like you mean it." "I understand you." His voice was steady, no wavering, no performance. Just 2 words said with the full weight of someone who had spent 20 years making and keeping certain promises and understood exactly what the register felt like. "I understand you completely." The room was quiet. Outside the windows, the city was settling into evening, the specific blue-gray light of a Chicago autumn at 6 in the evening, the beginning of the long dark. "Her name is Zora," Nia said. She heard herself say it and felt the shift in the room, the particular intimacy of a name given to a stranger, the trust it required, the risk she was taking. "She's 2, almost 3. She paused. "She's stubborn. She wakes up early because the light does things she wants to watch. She holds railings with both hands. She already knows how to make people feel like she's considering them very seriously, and she uses it to get extra time before bed." Tae-jun sat very still. "She has your eyes," Nia said. "She knows they're different from mine. She doesn't know what that means yet." He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose, a gesture she had seen from him precisely twice in 3 years, both times in situations that had cost him something he genuinely valued. He pressed hard for a moment, and then released it and looked at the table. "I want to ask you something," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been. "Not much. Enough. Go ahead." "The night I exiled you." He looked up. His eyes found hers and held. "You already knew?" "No, I found out 3 weeks after." "And you didn't call you?" She looked at him evenly. "No." "Why?" "Because I'd stood in a hallway outside your study and listened to you describe your wife as a burden and a liability and a woman who brought nothing useful to your operation." She kept her voice level. She had practiced this, not practiced it for this room, not specifically, but practiced the act of saying the hard thing without letting it break her voice, because she'd learned that when your voice broke, the other person focused on your pain instead of their own accountability. And I decided that a man who saw his wife that way would see his child as an asset, a piece on a board, an heir to a name. Her jaw tightened. I wasn't going to let her be that. He sat with that. A long time. "I said those things," he said finally. "Yes. I believed them." "I know you did. That was the problem." Another silence. This one had more space in it. Room to move, room to breathe, room for the next thing that needed to be said. Then the door opened. Nia turned. The man who entered was not staff. He was broad, mid-40s, in a dark coat, moving with the specific economy of someone who spent their professional life managing physical space in relation to other people's bodies. I was one of Tae-jun's security detail. She recognized the quality of his presence, even if she didn't know his face. He'd replaced people she used to recognize. He spoke in Korean. Quiet, urgent. 4 sentences. Tae-jun's body changed. It was subtle, barely visible from across the table. But Nia had spent 3 years reading the precise shift from Tae-jun at rest to Tae-jun engaged operationally, and she saw it happen in real time. The stillness reorganized, the weight of the room redistributed around him. He responded in Korean. Short, clipped. The security man retreated and the door closed. Tae-jun looked at Nia. His face had resumed its professional configuration, but something underneath it was moving fast. "What just happened?" she said. "Nothing that involves you." "You're lying." A beat. Then, "There's a situation. It's being managed. It doesn't—" Tae-jun. Her voice came out flat and hard. "I spent 3 years in your world. I know what a security interruption in the middle of an off-books private meeting looks like. Don't tell me it doesn't involve me." He looked at her. She watched him make a decision. She could see the exact moment he made it, the quality of resolution that moved across his face. "There's a man named Park Dae-jung," he said. "He runs a rival organization out of Detroit. For the past 3 years, he's been building intelligence on everyone in my network, past and present." He paused. "His people identified you when you took the Whitmore contract. They've been building a file." Nia's stomach contracted to a point. "How long?" she said. "We believe 6 to 8 weeks." 6 to 8 weeks. She'd taken the contract 11 weeks ago. "What's in the file?" He looked at her directly. "Everything Quan found. And more." "More." She heard the word come out of her own mouth. Flat. "What does more mean?" "They know Zora exists," he said, "and they know that the birth certificate lists no father, and they've been doing arithmetic." The room didn't change. The light through the windows was the same. The table was the same. The chair under her was the same solid weight. Inside Nia's chest, Something was happening that she had no name for. Not fear exactly, not the cold dread she'd managed her way through for 2.5 years. Something more total than fear. Something that started in her sternum and moved outward into her limbs and made everything feel simultaneously very slow and very clear. "They're going to move on this," she said. Not a question. "We think within the week." Park's standard method is to use leverage, proof of connection between a target and something or someone they're protecting. His goal isn't violence, it's control. He takes the thing that matters most and he uses it to control you, Nia said. Through her. The word her sat between them. Tae-jun nodded. Nia stood up. "I need to call Imani." "Already handled. I have 2 of my people." "No." She turned and looked at him, and the look stopped him cold. "No one from your organization goes near my daughter. I don't care what the threat is. That's not a conversation. That's a condition." "Nia, Park's people are—" "I said no." Her voice was shaking, slightly. She heard it. She pressed through it. "You want to help? Tell me everything you know about what Park has, what his timeline is, and who he's using to run this. Give me the information. That's how you help me right now, not by putting your people in Zora's space." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled his phone out and unlocked it and slid it across the table. "The summary is in the second file. Read it." She read it standing up, at the table, phone in one hand, her other hand pressed flat against the wood surface to keep herself grounded. She read fast. She'd always read fast, had trained herself in Tae-jun's world to extract the operational core of a document without drowning in its periphery. Park Tae-jun, 51. Detroit-based. 8 years of expansion into Chicago market fringe. Intelligence operation that ran parallel to his street organization and was significantly more sophisticated. Network of informants embedded in legitimate business structures. Current focus, SEO Tae-jun's network. Weaknesses, following a territorial dispute 8 months prior. Identified leverage point, connection between SEO Tae-jun and Nia Whitaker, née SEO. Current investigation line, the child. Known associates in Chicago, 3 named individuals. One of them currently positioned within 3 blocks of Aurelia Private Events registered commercial kitchen address. Nia looked at that last line for a long time. 3 blocks from her kitchen. She looked up. "The person at my kitchen address. How long?" "We think 4 weeks." 4 weeks. 4 weeks ago, she'd been doing prep work for the Kellerman event. She'd been at that kitchen 12 hours over 2 days. She'd had Deja with her. She'd left through the same door she always used because it was closer to parking. She thought about whether she'd noticed anything. Ran the memories back. A van parked on the cross street 2 of those days. She'd registered it and filed it away as nothing and moved on because she didn't have time for every unfamiliar vehicle to become a threat. She should have made time. "I need a location for all 3, she said. "Everything you have on Park's Chicago operation. Timeline, personnel, method of approach." "Why?" "Because I'm not sitting in this room and waiting for someone to make a move on my daughter. I need to understand what I'm actually dealing with." She put the phone on the table and looked at him. "And I need to know what you intend to do." Tae-jun stood up. The shift was visible to... He came to his full height, and the room reorganized around him the way it always did, the quality of his presence filling the available space. But there was something different in it tonight. Not the cold operational composure she'd spent 3 years watching him deploy. Something more exposed. Something that cost him more than composure to maintain. "I intend to make sure this doesn't reach her," he said. "However that needs to happen." "However that needs to happen." She repeated it back to him without inflection. "Tae-jun, be specific." Park needs to understand that Nia Whitaker is not a viable leverage point. That means he needs to understand that his intelligence is incorrect, that there is no connection between you and me that he can use. He has the birth record. The birth record lists no father. His voice was very controlled. What Park has is arithmetic and speculation. What he doesn't have is confirmation, yet. So you want to, what? Create a different narrative. "I want to eliminate the value of the one he's building." He held her gaze. "Park is looking for a weakness. I can make sure he finds nothing worth using." He paused. "But I can't do that if you're holding me at arm's length. I need to know Zora is somewhere secure while we address Park's operation. I told you, your people don't go near her. Then tell me whose people can. He took a step toward the table. Not threatening. There was no aggression in it, just urgency. Nia, I understand the conditions. I accept them. But this isn't a situation where conditions are the primary issue. The primary issue is a man who has 3 people within proximity of your daughter's daily life and a week before he moves. Tell me what you need from me and I will do it, but give me something to work with. She stared at him. The thing about Tae-jun, the thing she'd spent 3 years trying to reconcile, that she'd dismantled piece by piece over 2.5 years of being away from him, was that he was not wrong when he was operating. He was ruthless, and he was flawed, and he had done things she could not forgive and was not yet trying to. But when he identified a problem and organized himself around solving it, he was rarely wrong about the shape of what needed to happen. She hated that this moment required her to know that about him. There's a woman, she said. Her name is Celeste. She's a client, but she's more than that. Her family has 3 properties outside the city. She owes me a favor that's larger than she's acknowledged yet. Nia picked up her own phone. I can make a call. Get Zora and Amani to one of those properties for a week. Without your name anywhere near the arrangement. Do it. I'm already doing it. She was already dialing. While I'm on this call, you're going to text me everything in that file. Not a summary. Everything. He picked up his phone. She turned slightly away and listened to the ringtone, once, twice, and then Celeste's voice, warm, slightly surprised, the social register of a woman accustomed to evening calls about event details. Celeste, Nia said, I need to ask you something and I need you to listen before you answer. She kept the conversation brief and specific. Celeste, to her credit, asked 2 questions, received 2 answers, and said yes. Nia had known she would. The favor was indeed larger than Celeste had acknowledged, and Celeste was the kind of woman who understood the social architecture of debts precisely. She hung up, turned back to the room. Tae-jun was still at the table, typing. It's done, she said. He looked up. Celeste who? Not your business. He looked at her for a moment, then he went back to his phone. Everything's been sent. She pulled up the messages. The volume of information was significant, the kind of comprehensive intelligence summary that cost either a significant amount of money or a significant network to produce. She started reading. Park Dae-jung's Chicago operation was 3 people on the ground, coordinated remotely from Detroit, with a contact person embedded in a legitimate commercial laundry business on the west side. The 3 field operatives moved between 4 rotating positions, 2 near Aurelia's kitchen, 1 near Zora's daycare. The daycare. She stopped. He has someone near the daycare, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Yes. Tae-jun's voice was equally quiet. Since approximately 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, she had dropped Zora off, watched her run toward the building's entrance in the red jacket, watched the whole arm wave, driven to Margaret's office to talk about legal protective structures. 40 feet away, maybe less, someone had been watching. Something moved through Nia that was not quite any single emotion she had a name for. It moved fast and it moved total, and for approximately 4 seconds she couldn't speak because the full physical reality of it was occupying every available space in her chest. She breathed through it. You've had eyes on Park's people since when, she said. 3 days. Why haven't you moved on them? Because moving on them without a strategy creates a void that Park fills with a different approach and different personnel. You neutralize the visible threat and the invisible one accelerates. His voice was the operational register now. Clear, specific, stripped of everything extraneous. You need to eliminate the reason he has an interest in this, not just the people he's deployed. Which means what exactly? It means I need to make a public move that closes the narrative he's building. He paused. The event. The Aurelia launch next week. She looked at him. What about it? Let me use it. He held her gaze. The December launch was always going to be a significant corporate event. Whitmore Group principals, investor network, business press. If I stand in that room and publicly credit Nia Whitaker and Aurelia with the execution of this event in front of that audience, in front of people Park's network will have contact with, I establish the nature of this relationship in public terms. Vendor, professional, clean, No leverage point. Nia absorbed this. You want to stand up in my event and make a speech about my company? About the professional relationship? Yes. And you think Park backs off because you've established that this is a business arrangement? I think Park backs off because publicly attributing our connection to a vendor relationship makes the arithmetic he's built far less useful. If I'm standing in a room of 150 people crediting you as a professional partner, the narrative that you're a hidden personal vulnerability becomes significantly harder to operationalize. She stared at him. That's a significant thing to do in front of your investor network, she said. In front of people who know your organizational structure. You'd be publicly associating the Whitmore Group with a small hospitality company run by your ex-wife. Yes. What does that cost you? He didn't hesitate. It costs me a degree of private information entering a public space, which I can manage. He paused. It costs me nothing I'm not willing to pay. She looked at him for a long time. At the fatigue she could now see in the area around his eyes that his composure didn't quite reach. At the set of his jaw. At the hands, flat on the table, still. If I agree to this, she said, the event runs on my terms. My execution, my staff, my timeline. You are a guest in that room. You show up when I tell you, and you leave when it's done, and you don't improvise. Agreed. And Park's 3 people will be managed before the event. Managed how? Persuasively. He held her gaze without flinching. No one gets hurt. Park understands that his Chicago operation has been identified. He withdraws. And if he doesn't, something moved across his face, brief and controlled and very cold. He will. She believed him. She had not believed many things about Tae-jun in the past 2.5 years, but she believed that. She believed it in the specific bone-level way you believe things about a person when you've watched them operate long enough to understand what their resolve actually looks like. She pulled out a chair and sat back down. I'm going to drive to Imani's now, she said. I'm going to pack Zora and Imani and get them out of the city tonight. And then I'm going to come back and spend the next 6 days executing the best event Aurelia has ever produced. She looked at him across the table. And you are going to do what you said you'd do. Yes. And when it's over, we are going to have a different conversation. About Zora. About what the arrangement looks like going forward. She didn't soften it, and she didn't qualify it. Not tonight, after. But it's happening. He nodded. Once, complete. She stood up, picked up her bag. She was almost at the door when he said her name. She stopped. Didn't turn around immediately. Then she did. He was still at the table, both hands flat on the surface, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not in 3 years of marriage, not in the divorce room, not in any conference room since. It was not composed. It was not strategic. It was something more unguarded than that, something that lived below the level of control he maintained in every other circumstance. I said you brought nothing to my table, he said. His voice was rough in a way that composure couldn't fully smooth. I said it, and I believed it. I want you to know that I understand what those words cost. What I cost you. Nia stood in the doorway. She looked at him for a moment. The man she had married. The man who had signed her away with the efficiency of closing a lease. The man who had sat across from her in meeting after meeting, holding a secret about her daughter's existence while she walked in thinking she had the full picture. The man who was sitting at a table in an empty room telling her the truth, as far as she could tell, without anything left to gain from telling it. I know you understand, she said. The question is what you do with the understanding. She left. The elevator took her down. The lobby was quiet. The street outside was the full dark of a Chicago autumn evening, cold moving through her coat the moment she hit the air. She walked to her car. She got in. She sat for exactly 15 seconds, hands on the wheel, not driving, just breathing through her nose and letting the past 90 minutes settle into the body the way a hard thing needs to settle before you can carry it correctly. Then she started the engine and drove to Imani's apartment. Imani opened the door before Nia knocked. She'd been watching from the window, she said, though the way she'd been sitting told a different story, the kind of vigil you keep when you don't know what form bad news is going to arrive in. Pack for a week, Nia said. Both of you, warm clothes, Zora's books and the small art set. Don't overthink it. Imani looked at her face. How bad? We're handling it. But you need to be out of the city tonight. Imani didn't argue. She went to pack. Nia went into the bedroom. Zora was asleep in the same configuration she always slept in. Leg out, hair spread, dark and tangled, one small fist pressed against the mattress. Nia stood at the edge of the bed and looked at her daughter's face in the low light from the doorway. The gray eyes were closed. Nia sat on the edge of the bed. She reached out and put her hand on Zora's back. The rise and fall of that small chest, even and slow, completely unbothered by the world and everything it had been doing tonight while she slept. She sat there for a moment. Then she leaned down and pressed her lips to the top of Zora's head. The dark hair, the particular warmth of a sleeping child, the smell of the lavender shampoo they used on wash days. "I've got you," she said quietly. Not for Zora's benefit. Zora was asleep, completely unreachable by the world right now. She said it for herself. She said it the way you say the thing that needs to be true out loud so the air around you has heard it. She stood up. She went back to the kitchen and started making a list of everything that needed to happen in the next 6 days. The launch event had 400 square feet of florals that needed confirming. A custom menu for 150 guests that Deja had been developing for 3 weeks. 12 staff, 6 of them new, all of them needing a final briefing. Audio setup. Lighting coordination. A 2-hour timeline that required 17 sequential handoffs to execute without visible seam. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Tae-jun was going to stand up in a room full of his investors and say her name in public. She wrote it all down. She wrote it in the fast, specific shorthand of someone who had spent 2.5 years learning to convert chaos into a list, and a list into a plan, and a plan into the next thing that needed to happen, because the next thing that needed to happen was always the only thing she could actually control. Amani came into the kitchen with 2 bags and Zora's small art set tucked under one arm. She looked at Nia writing at the table, the focused downward angle of someone deep inside a problem, and she set the bags down quietly. "Ready," she said. Nia capped the pen, stood up, looked at her cousin, the woman who had opened a door at 11:40 at night for a soaking wet, shaking woman with 1 bag and no plan, and had made the couch up without asking a single question. "Thank you," Nia said, "for all of it." Amani shook her head. "Family. Get your coat." Nia got her coat. She carried Zora to the car without waking her, the familiar weight settling against her shoulder, Zora's fist finding the fabric of Nia's collar, and sleep with the instinctive grip of someone anchoring themselves to the most reliable thing in their world. Nia held her tighter than she needed to. She drove out of the city with the heater running and the radio low, Zora asleep in the back, Amani riding quiet in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and her face turned slightly toward the window, watching the city lights thin out and give way to the long flat dark of the highway heading north. 6 days. She had 6 days to execute the most important event of Aurelia's existence, dismantle a leverage operation built by a man she'd never met, and stand in a room with her ex-husband while he did something in public that she had not asked for and could not have predicted 2.5 years ago when she walked out of an elevator and sat on the steps of a closed laundromat in the rain and counted minutes until she could stand. She pressed the accelerator. Ahead, the highway stretched out long and dark, and completely indifferent to everything she was carrying, which was fine, which was exactly what she needed from it, just the next mile, and the one after, until she reached somewhere she could set Zora down and know she was safe, and then turn around and go back and finish what she'd started. The 6 days felt like 6 different kinds of weather stacked inside the same week. Monday was logistics, pure, grinding, unglamorous logistics. Nia was back in the city by 7 in the morning, Zora and Amani, safely at Celeste's property, 2 hours north, and she went directly to the commercial kitchen on West Kinsey without stopping at the apartment, without eating, without doing anything except driving and then parking and then walking through the kitchen door and starting to work. Deja was already there. She looked up when Nia came in and read her face with the same quick accuracy she applied to everything. "Bad week," Deja said. "Working week," Nia said. "Where are we on the protein course?" They were in it, fully, completely in it, within 4 minutes. The menu for 150 guests was the kind of undertaking that required a specific kind of sustained focus, the kind that burned clean and left no room for anything else, which was exactly what Nia needed. She needed her mind completely occupied with things she could control. The braise timing, the garnish prep, the alignment between the savory courses and the dessert sequence Deja had developed over 3 weeks, with the focused intensity of someone who took it personally when flavors didn't have a logical conversation with each other. Nia checked the florals confirmation, the audio setup schedule, the lighting vendor's revised timeline. She called each of her 12 event staff individually, not to micromanage, but because she'd learned that people performed better when they felt individually seen before a high-stakes execution. And she'd learned it the hard way, through events that had gone sideways in the small hours, because someone on the team had felt like a number. She did not call Tae-jun. He did not call her. That was its own kind of negotiation, the agreement, unspoken, that the space between the dinner in the private room and the night of the event was operational territory, not personal, and that personal would come after. On Wednesday afternoon, Kwon called. She almost didn't answer. She answered because not answering felt like a luxury she couldn't currently afford. Information was moving faster than she could track it, and she needed every piece she could get. Park's Chicago people have been contacted, Kwon said, without any preamble. His voice had the flat economy of someone delivering an operational briefing. All three. They've been made aware that their positions have been identified and that the organization understands the nature of their assignment. And Park has been informed directly that the intelligence he's built around Nia Whitaker and Aurelia private events does not represent a viable leverage point, that the relationship is professional and will be publicly framed as such at a significant event this Saturday. Did he accept that? A pause. He's a calculating man. He understands cost-benefit. Making a move on a leverage point that's been publicly neutralized costs more than it gains. Another pause, shorter. The three field operatives withdrew from their positions this morning. Nia stood at the kitchen counter with the phone against her ear and her free hand pressed flat on the cold metal surface. The one near the daycare, she said. Gone, as of 8:45. She breathed through her nose, out through her mouth, in. Thank you, she said. Ms. Whitaker, Kwon's voice shifted, almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. For what it's worth, what you built, the company, the way you... He stopped. She could hear him deciding how much of this he was going to say. It matters. I want you to know that someone in his organization noticed. She didn't know what to do with that, coming from Kwon. She settled for noted. She hung up. She stood at the counter for a moment. Then she called Imani. How is she? She found a stick shaped like the letter Y and has been carrying it everywhere for 3 days, Imani said. She calls it her measurement stick. She is measuring everything in the house. I don't know what unit of measurement she's using, but it seems to be consistent. Something unlocked in Nia's chest. A small thing. Enough. I'll call you tonight, she said. Nia. Imani's voice dropped. You okay? Getting there. Good enough. A beat. The kitchen is going to be incredible Saturday. I know it. Nia managed something close to a real smile. It better be. Thursday and Friday were the kind of days that became purely physical, her body moving through tasks with the trained efficiency of someone who had logged enough event preparation hours that the sequence was in her muscles. She stopped thinking about Park Tae-jun. She stopped thinking about Kwon. She stopped thinking about everything that wasn't the next item on her list, because the next item on her list was the only thing that existed, and when you treated it that way, there was a particular piece in it, narrow, demanding, clean. On Friday evening, she walked the venue alone. It was a converted industrial space in the West Loop. High ceilings, original brick, massive windows that let the evening light in at a specific angle that made everything inside look like it had been lit by someone who understood drama. She'd known when she first walked it 3 months ago that the space would do half the work if she let it. She'd built the event design around that. Nothing that competed with the light, nothing excessive, the kind of restraint that wealthy people recognized as more sophisticated than spectacle. She walked the floor in the quiet, touching things, running her palm along a table edge, checking the placement of the florals against the window line, standing at the point where she'd positioned the small riser for remarks, and looking out at the arrangement of tables from that angle, understanding the sightlines, the way a person standing there would see and be seen. She stood there for a moment. She thought about what Tae-jun was going to say from this spot tomorrow. She thought about what it meant, not operationally. She'd already processed the operational meaning thoroughly. She'd turned it over from every angle while she drove, and while she prepped, and while she stared at the kitchen ceiling during the rare moments she stopped moving, she thought about what it meant in the other way, the harder way, the way that didn't have a clean column in any ledger she could organize. He was going to stand in front of his investors and his business associates and the assembled weight of the public-facing Whitmore Group identity, and he was going to credit a woman he'd described as bringing nothing useful to his operation. No one in that room would know the full story. But she would know. He would know. And somehow that was both less than she'd needed for 2.5 years and more than she'd expected to ever receive. She turned off the lights and locked the venue and drove home. She slept 6 hours. For her, during a production week, that was extravagant. Saturday arrived gray and cold and sharp. The specific cold of a Chicago November that meant business, the kind that didn't negotiate with your jacket. Nia was at the venue at 7. Deja arrived at 7:15 with 2 of her prep team. By 9, the kitchen was running. By 11, the florals were in. By 1, the lighting vendor had completed the rig, and the AV team was running the room check for the program elements. Nia moved through all of it, checking, adjusting, releasing, trusting the people she'd put in place to do what she'd placed them there to do, which was the thing she'd learned most slowly and with the most difficulty over the course of building Aurelia. That the quality of a production was set in the hiring and the briefing, and by the day of, your job was to receive information and make decisions, not to do every task personally, because you didn't trust anyone else to do it right. She trusted Deja. She trusted the floor manager she'd brought in, a woman named Renata, 51, who had spent 20 years in hotel banquet management and had a way of moving through a crowded room that was practically invisible, which was exactly the quality Nia needed. She trusted her bar team, her service staff, her coat check. At 4 in the afternoon, she went to the small side room she'd designated as her staging area and changed into the dress she'd brought. Not an elaborate thing, she didn't do elaborate, but a deep emerald green that worked with her complexion and her short natural hair in a way that was precise without being studied. She looked at herself in the mirror on the back of the door. She looked like someone who had somewhere to be. She went back out to the floor. Guests began arriving at 6. The room filled with the particular energy of people who were accustomed to rooms like this. The practiced ease, the quality of conversation that happened between people who were always slightly performing their own competence for each other. Nia moved through the edges of it, visible enough to be identified as the person in charge, not so present as to become part of the social texture of the event. Her job tonight was execution. The room was the host. Aurelia was the instrument. She saw Tae-jun arrive at 6:20. He came alone. No Quan, no security detail, no entourage. He was wearing a dark suit with a white shirt open at the collar, and he moved through the arriving guests with the natural authority of someone who had walked into rooms full of important people for 20 years and never once found it unfamiliar. People who recognized him moved toward him with the small gravitational pull that wealth and reputation produced. He was gracious, brief. He kept moving. His eyes found her across the room. She gave him a short, professional nod. He returned it exactly. The first 2 hours ran cleanly. Cleanly was a relative word. There was a service timing issue in the third course that Renata caught and absorbed before it became visible at table level, and one of the florals on the east side arrangement shed more than it should have, and Nia had one of her floor staff address it without drawing attention, and the bar ran low on a specific sparkling water that required a quiet resupply coordination, but none of it surfaced. The room saw nothing but an evening that moved with the kind of ease that good execution always produced, and that good execution always knew was earned, not accidental. At 8:15, Sandra, who had been working the room on the Whitmore Group's behalf with professional warmth, appeared at Nia's elbow and said quietly, "He'd like to do remarks in about 12 minutes. Will that work with service flow?" "Oh, yes," Nia said. "I'll have Renata hold the dessert course." She found Renata, gave her the instruction, watched Renata move into position. She found a place to stand along the south wall where she could see the riser and the room simultaneously. At 8:28, Sandra used the room's sound system to bring the conversation down and direct attention to the front. Tae-jun moved to the riser. The room's attention reorganized itself around him with the speed of people accustomed to following authority. He spoke for 6 minutes. She'd thought she was prepared for it. She'd run it through her head multiple times. The operational purpose, the calculated public repositioning, the specific way it would land in a room full of people who understood the Whitmore Group's organizational culture. She'd prepared herself the way she prepared herself for every high-stakes variable in an event, by modeling it in advance and removing as much of the unknown as possible. She had not fully prepared herself for the sound of his voice saying her name in a room like this. He talked about the event, about Aurelia private events, about the quality of execution the company had brought to the Whitmore Group's most significant calendar event of the year. He said the company had brought something to this room that his organization's internal capacity couldn't have produced, a precision and a discretion and an instinct for what the moment required. He said that the founder of Aurelia was someone who understood, better than most, what it meant to build something worth standing behind. He did not look at her while he said it. She understood why. Looking at her would have changed the quality of the moment. It would have made it personal in a visible way. By keeping his eyes on the room, he was doing what she'd asked him to do, making this public without making it private, establishing the professional narrative without collapsing it into something more complicated in front of 150 people. When he finished, the room gave him the warm, attentive applause of people who had just had a good evening and were feeling generous. Nia breathed through her nose. She signaled Renata. Dessert service began moving. She did not go to him immediately. She managed the final hour of the event with the focused attention it required, moving through the closing logistics, the thank yous, the coat retrieval, the vendor coordination, the breakdown schedule for Sunday morning. She shook hands, received compliments with the measured warmth she'd developed for moments like these, ensured every element of the evening finished at the quality it had started. By 10:15, the room had cleared to a small remainder of guests in extended conversation. By 10:40, it was empty. She found Tae-jun near the west window, the last person standing in the room. He had his jacket on, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the street below in the particular way of someone who has just finished something significant and hasn't quite decided where to put it yet. "You're still here," she said. "I didn't know if you'd have something you needed to say." She stood beside him, not close, 2 feet of space, the professional distance she'd maintained across every meeting, looking out at the same street. "You did what you said you'd do," she said. "Yes." The words, about Aurelia. She paused. "They were right. They were true," he said. "There's a difference. True things aren't always what you plan to say." She turned and looked at his profile, the line of his jaw, the tiredness she could see more clearly now, with the room empty and the performance stripped away. The genuine tiredness of a man who had been carrying a weight he hadn't known he was carrying until it became too large to ignore. "I want to tell you something," she said. He turned to look at her. "I don't forgive you." She said it without heat, without cruelty, directly. "Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. I want to be clear about that because I don't want what happens next to be built on a version of this that isn't honest." He nodded. "But I'm not going to use Zora against you," she said. "She's not a punishment. She's a person. And she's going to grow up knowing that the people in her life are there because they chose to be, not because they were obligated." She held his gaze. "So if you want to be in her life, the terms are mine. Completely, fully mine. Not negotiable. Not adjusted over time based on organizational considerations or what's useful for the SEO name." "Understood. And you're going to be someone she can count on. Not grand gestures. Not money. Money is easy, and you know that. She's going to need someone who shows up, on ordinary days, who remembers the specific things she cares about, who doesn't make promises and then have Kwon call to reschedule." "Yes. I mean it, Tae-jun." "I know you mean it." His voice was very quiet. "So do I." She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at the window. "Margaret is setting up a trust structure," she said, "legally separated from your organization, for Zora's education and future. I'll accept that." She felt him turn to look at her. "Not because I need it, because she deserves it. And because you should have something concrete that you're responsible for contributing, something she can see when she's old enough to understand what it represents. Whatever Margaret needs from my end, I'll provide. I'll have her contact Kwon. Kwon is available." They stood at the window for a moment. The street below was quiet in the way Chicago got quiet late on a cold November night. Not empty, but unhurried, people moving with their coats pulled against the wind, the particular human posture of a city in winter. "When?" he said. "When can I meet her?" Nia had known this was coming. She'd been carrying her answer to it for 3 days, turning it over, examining it, not from the angle of what she felt about it, because what she felt about it was complicated enough to get lost in, but from the angle of what was right, what was true, what Zora deserved. "Give me a month," she said. "I need to bring her home. I need her to be in her space and her routine. And I need to have a conversation with her that's appropriate for a 2-year-old. Not the full truth, she can't carry the full truth yet, but enough. That she's going to meet someone, that it's okay." She paused. "And I need that month to watch whether the man who made those promises tonight is the same man in 30 days. He accepted that without argument. "Daylight," she said. "Public place. My terms on every detail." "Yes." "Don't buy her anything expensive. She will not be impressed. She'll want to show you the stick shaped like the letter Y that she's been carrying all week." Something moved across his face. The first involuntary thing she'd seen from him all evening. Not quite a smile. Something more fragile than a smile, and more real. "I'll be appropriately impressed by the stick," he said. She turned away from the window. She picked up her bag from the chair where she'd left it. She looked at the empty room, the space she'd built an evening inside, the tables bare now, the florals beginning to close in the cooled air, the particular quiet of a room that had been full and was now finished. She'd done this. She'd built this. Every person who'd stood in this room tonight had been a guest in something she'd created from nothing, from a $40 cupcake order, and her grandmother's index card, and a couch in a borrowed apartment, and 19 hours of labor in a public hospital, and 4 years of grinding through every shift she could find. She'd built her own table. She turned back to Tae-jun. "Good night," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face that she recognized as the beginning of something. Not an ending, not a conclusion, but the specific opening of a much longer and harder and more uncertain thing that neither of them fully knew the shape of yet. "Good night," he said. She walked out. The month that followed was the quietest month Nia had experienced since before Zora was born. Not quiet as in peaceful, not yet, but quiet in the way of a storm that has passed and left behind a changed landscape that requires reorientation before you can navigate it correctly. She brought Zora and Amani home from Celeste's property on a Sunday. Zora came through the apartment door carrying the Y-shaped stick and immediately put it in her designated important things spot on the shelf above her bed. She didn't ask where they'd been or why they'd left quickly. She asked if the neighbor's cat had been fed while they were away. Nia had forgotten about the neighbor's cat. She went and knocked on Mrs. Odom's door and found out the cat had been fed by Mrs. Odom herself and had in fact had a fine week. She relayed this to Zora, who considered it and then moved on. Aurelia had 4 new inquiries waiting in Nia's inbox when she checked it Monday morning. 2 had come directly from guests at the Saturday event. 1 had come from someone who'd heard about it secondhand. The 4th was from an organization Nia didn't recognize, which turned out to be a nonprofit focused on professional development for low-income women in the service industry. They'd heard about her through 2 separate referrals and wanted to discuss a partnership that might be mutually beneficial. She read that last one twice. The training program she'd been sketching on napkins for more than a year. The idea that had started as something abstract and kept returning with more detail, more shape, more pull, had been in some form of development in the back of her mind through every week of every month since she'd started doing the thing she'd been trying to build a pipeline back to for the next generation of women who'd find themselves where she'd been. She called the number. She had a conversation. She asked and answered the right questions. By the following Friday, she had a meeting scheduled. Margaret called the week after the event with a legal update. The trust structure was drafted. The separation from Tae-jun's organizational holdings was clean, professionally verifiable, and structured so that neither Nia nor Zora's identity would be exposed through its administration. Kwan had provided everything Margaret had requested with the efficiency of someone who understood precisely what was at stake and intended to get it right. Margaret had one additional note. He asked me to include a provision, his language, not mine, that if Zora ever wants to know more about its origins, the full story, that information is held and accessible when she's ready for it. Not hidden, not managed, just held. Nia sat with that for a long moment. "Keep it," she said, exactly as he wrote it. "I thought you'd say that," Margaret said. "I'll have the final documents to you by end of week." The meeting happened on a Saturday morning, 32 days after the event. 32 because Nia had decided on 30, and then added two more because she needed to know she was choosing the day and not counting down to it. She'd told Zora 3 days before. Not the whole story. Zora was 2 years and 7 months old, and the whole story was not a thing she had any capacity for yet, and wouldn't for years, and Nia had spent considerable time thinking about what the right version was for right now. She'd settled on the truth at the level Zora could hold it. There was someone who wanted to meet her, someone who was part of where Zora came from, on her dad's side. He had gray eyes, like hers. Zora had looked at Nia very seriously for a moment. Does he know about measurement sticks? Nia had said she wasn't sure, but that Zora could tell him. Zora had seemed to find this acceptable. The park was a small one, a neighborhood park with a path around the perimeter and a bench area and a section of grass where you could see the whole space from any point, which was why Nia had chosen it. She needed to be able to see everything. She arrived first with Zora, and they walked the path twice, while Zora narrated observations about various things she found interesting. A bird that was hopping on one leg, a puddle with something iridescent on the surface, a section of the path where the bricks were a slightly different color than the rest, which Zora knelt down and examined with the focused gravity of a geologist. Nia saw Tae-jun arrive at the gate. He had come alone. No driver waiting visible, no security in the peripheral positions she'd been trained to notice. He was wearing dark pants and a dark coat, and he looked, from this distance, like exactly what he was. A man who had dressed carefully for something that mattered, and then tried to look like he hadn't. He saw her. He stopped at the gate and waited. She looked down at Zora, still crouched over the different colored bricks. "Zoo," she said. "The person I told you about is here." Zora stood up. She looked toward the gate with the direct, measuring attention that was entirely her own. Not inherited, not learned, just the particular quality she'd arrived with and had been deploying with increasing precision for 2 years. She looked at Nia. "The eyes?" she said. "Yes." Zora looked back toward the gate. She thought about it for a moment with the visible seriousness of someone running a genuine assessment. "Okay," she said. They walked toward the gate together. Nia's hand in Zora's hand, Zora carrying the Y-shaped stick in her free hand because she had brought it, because it went where she went, non-negotiable. Tae-jun came through the gate when he saw them moving toward him. He stopped when they were about 10 feet away, and then he did the thing that Nia had not expected and that she knew afterward would stay with her for a long time. He crouched down, slowly, deliberately, until he was at Zora's eye level, and then he stopped and waited. Zora approached without hesitation. She stopped in front of him and looked at his face with the full weight of her attention, the way she looked at the different colored bricks and the iridescent puddle and the one-legged bird. Then she looked at his eyes. She was quiet for a moment. "They're the same," she said. His jaw moved, once. "Yeah," he said. His voice came out rough. "They are." Zora held up the Y-shaped stick. "This is my measurement stick." He looked at it. He looked at it with genuine attention. "What do you measure with it?" "Things," she said, "to see how big they are. But it's not numbers. It's more like you just know." He nodded slowly, like this made complete sense. "That sounds like a good system." Zora considered him. "Do you want to see how big the bench is?" "Yes," he said. "I really do." Zora turned and walked toward the bench. Tae-jun stood back up. He was slower getting up than going down. Something in the left knee, she noticed, that he didn't make anything of, just absorbed and moved past. He glanced at Nia as he straightened. She looked back at him steadily. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They followed Zora to the bench. The morning moved the way those mornings do when you're paying close attention to something. Slowly, with a quality of detail that ordinary time didn't usually carry. Zora measured the bench. She measured a tree. She found a pine cone and carried it in her coat pocket. She narrated a long and internally consistent story about 2 birds she'd identified across the park, which involved a dispute over a piece of bread and a resolution that she seemed to find satisfying. She asked Tae-jun whether he had ever seen a stick shaped like the letter Y before. He said he hadn't, that this was the first one. She seemed to believe this was the correct answer. Nia sat on the bench and watched. She watched Tae-jun crouch again when Zora found something on the ground worth examining, watched him listen with the same focused attention he brought to rooms full of executives, watched the precise moment when Zora decided he was acceptable and moved from evaluation mode into the ordinary, unguarded mode she operated in with people she'd cleared. It was a quiet morning, cold, but still. The light came through the trees at the angled, particular quality of late autumn in the Midwest. Not warm, not golden, just clean and honest. The kind of light that showed things as they were. Nia sat on the bench and watched her daughter introduce a man she didn't know yet to the system by which she measured the world, and she felt something that she was going to need a long time to find the right word for. Not forgiveness. That was still a long road, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Not relief, entirely, though there was some of that. Not happiness in any simple sense. Something more durable than any of those. Something built out of the specific material of having survived what she'd survived and come out the other side, still holding what mattered most, still standing, still herself, changed in every surface way and unchanged in every essential one. The months that followed had their own texture. Tae-jun came to the park on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the first time, and then the Saturday after that. He did not miss a Saturday without advance notice for 5 months. The advance notice, when it came, was always followed by a rescheduled time, always at Nia's convenience and Zora's rhythm. He brought nothing expensive. He brought once a children's book about a girl who was an astronomer because Zora had mentioned stars the last time, and that was the kind of thing he showed up with. The specific thing, not the impressive thing. Nia noticed. She filed it away without making anything of it in the moment, because she had promised herself she was going to watch for a long time before she made any conclusions. She watched for a long time. Aurelia's partnership with the nonprofit solidified into something Nia hadn't anticipated the scale of when she first took the call. The training program, the one she'd been sketching on napkins, the one that had started as an abstraction and kept returning with more detail, became real in the spring of the following year. 6 women in the first cohort, all of them single, all of them working, all of them in some version of the position Nia had been in 4 years earlier. Skilled and invisible, and without a structure that could hold what they were capable of. Nia didn't teach them to be her. She taught them what she'd actually learned, how to build something that didn't depend on someone else's permission to exist, how to read a contract before you sign it, how to price your work at its real value, how to stay standing when the thing you're building fails and you have to rebuild it. Deja was there for the first session, not as a student, as an assistant instructor. Her opinionated precision making the curriculum sharper than Nia could have made it alone. By the second cohort, there were 12 women. By the third, she had a wait list. Zora turned 3. Her birthday party was held in the kitchen of the apartment because that was where Nia's grandmother's recipes lived, and it seemed right. Imani brought sheet music because she always brought sheet music to celebrations, though she never played any of it, just left it somewhere on a surface as a kind of talisman. Mrs. Odom came from across the hall with a card she'd addressed, in her deliberate penmanship, to Miss Zora, which Zora kept. Tae-jun came for an hour at the end, after the main gathering had wound down. He sat at the kitchen table and ate a piece of the birthday cake, yellow with brown buttercream cheese frosting, the grandmother's recipe, exactly right. And Zora climbed onto the chair next to him without being invited and told him a detailed account of her birthday morning that involved the light doing a thing and a very good dream she'd had about a whale. He listened to every word. He caught Nia's eye once, across the kitchen, while Zora was mid-sentence about the whale. He held it for a moment. She looked back at him. She looked away first. Not because she needed to, because there were other things in the room that deserved her attention, and she chose them. That was different from before. Before, she'd looked away because the looking cost her something. Now she looked away because the looking was only one small thing among many, and the many were hers, and that was enough. The Whitmore contract concluded at the end of its calendar year. Nia did not renew it. She sent a professional termination notice that cited Aurelia's expanded capacity commitments in the coming year. Which was true, the waitlist for the training program had generated its own demand, and Aurelia's event calendar for the following year was already 40% booked. Sandra accepted the termination with professional warmth and said she hoped their paths would cross again. Tae-jun said nothing about the contract ending. She hadn't expected him to. The separation of his legitimate businesses from the organizational structure that had shaped him took longer than a season and cost him more than territory and money. Quan told her about some of it, in fragments, during the logistics calls they occasionally had about trust administration. She gathered more of it from the business press, which reported on the Whitmore Group's strategic restructuring with the mild interest of journalists who understood something was happening, but not quite what. Some allies left. Some partners withdrew. The organization became smaller and cleaner and less powerful in the ways that had always made it dangerous. She didn't thank him for it. It wasn't hers to thank him for. He was doing it for Zora, for the particular promise that Zora would not inherit the CO name's criminal geography, and that was between them. Between him and the daughter who was currently measuring the world with a stick and didn't know yet what his name had once meant, or what it had cost him to change the meaning of it. She would know eventually. That was the provision in the trust. When she was ready, the full story would be there, held and accessible. Not hidden, not managed, just waiting, the way true things wait. Patient, specific, without urgency, certain that the right moment would arrive without being forced. 2 years after the launch event, Nia stood outside a building on the north side at 7 in the morning, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching the city begin its day. The building was Aurelia's, not rented by the hour, not borrowed or shared. A proper commercial space, leased in Aurelia's name, with a kitchen that ran 5 days a week and a training room on the second floor where the next cohort of women was currently being oriented by Deja, who had become something between a co-director and an alter ego, equal parts argument and alignment. The city did its morning thing, buses, dogs, the specific quality of light at that hour in that season, pale, honest, without pretension. Zora came in out of the building behind her because Zora was 4 now, and on school-free days she sometimes came to work with Nia, sitting at the small desk in the corner of the administrative office with her important things and her narrations and her measurement system. She pushed through the door and stood beside Nia on the sidewalk and looked at the street with her gray eyes, which she had long since stopped asking about. "Is it cold?" Zora said. "Yes, but not bad cold." "Not bad cold," Nia agreed. Zora thought about this. "I like this kind." "Me too." They stood there for a moment, the two of them, on the sidewalk in front of the building that Nia had built, in the city that had swallowed her whole and she'd climbed back out of, in the life that was not the one she'd planned and was not the one she'd feared and was instead the one she'd made, specific and hers and harder and more durable than anything she could have been handed. Down the block, a car pulled to the curb. Tae-jun got out. He saw them on the sidewalk and stopped for a moment, and she could see even from this distance the particular quality of his stillness. The man who had spent a lifetime controlling rooms, who was still learning how to simply stand in one without needing to control it. He started walking toward them. Zora saw him. She raised her arm all the way up and waved with her whole body, the way she always did, the wave that was bigger than was strictly necessary and was exactly right. He raised his hand back. Nia watched him come. She had not gone back to him. She had not rebuilt what they'd had, because what they'd had been built on a foundation that neither of them should have stood on, and there was no version of reconstruction that started from that foundation that she trusted. But there was this, the Saturday mornings, the birthday cake, the whale dream recounted in careful detail, the trust documents that Margaret kept in a clean file, the slow and imperfect and genuinely uncertain thing that two people could build together when one of them had stopped trying to own it and the other had stopped trying to disappear from it. It wasn't a love story. Not in the way she'd once understood love stories. It was something more complicated than that, and she had come to believe more worth having. He reached them on the sidewalk. Zora immediately began a detailed account of a book she'd read that morning about deep-sea creatures that had their own light. He listened with the same focused attention he'd brought to everything she'd ever said to him, like she was the most important briefing he'd received all week, which, Nia suspected, was not far from the truth. Nia finished her coffee. She looked at the building, then at the street, then at her daughter's face, animated and specific and entirely itself, explaining bioluminescence to a man who ran a corporate empire and was learning, one Saturday at a time, that the most important thing he would ever do required none of the skills that had made him powerful and all of the ones he'd never been taught. She thought about the elevator descending 53 floors, the laundromat steps in the rain, the test in the coffee shop bathroom, the 19 hours and Denise's steady hands, and the first cry and the gray eyes opening. She thought about flour on her arms at 3 in the morning, a $40 check, a napkin with a word on it that meant golden. She thought about what it had taken to get here. All of it. Every hour of every shift and every envelope of cash and every cutout book and every meeting she'd walked into with her hands steady and her chest shaking and her face giving nothing away. She had built this. Not because someone gave it to her, not because the world decided she deserved it, because the world doesn't make those decisions. Because she got up one more time than she was knocked down, and then one more time after that, and she kept getting up until she was standing somewhere she'd built with her own hands on ground that belonged to no one but her. Tae-jun inherited an empire that made people afraid of the CO name. Nia Whitaker built something that made her daughter afraid of nothing. Zora would inherit neither kingdom nor cage. She would inherit what her mother's hands had made and what her father's hands were slowly, painfully learning to unmake. And from the space between those two things, she would build whatever she decided to build. And that, all of that, was freedom. The only kind that